Hi. Okay, it's saying that I'm starting to stream, but I'm not seeing. I have another laptop set up, but I'm not seeing anything come through. There was a delay yesterday, but not this long. Oh, darn it. It says you can totally see. Yeah, so I just got to figure out where the video is. You can see me? Okay. Oh, okay. I just have to stop that because it's actually. Second. Okay, and the stream stopped, right? Okay, and you're not. Okay, what do you see on the screen? Do you see? Excellent. Okay, can you hear me come through it? Okay, I'm going to start anyway. If you can see that image, excellent. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start in 2 seconds. Okay, hi. Thank you for joining us and thanks for staying with us for that little bit of technical difficulty we had. There's a 30-second delay, so it was just taking 30 seconds to come through my screen. So welcome to our first Brilliant Labs video tutorial, our first Brilliant Labs YouTube live stream. We wanted to create this event for two reasons. First, we wanted to share with you the exciting ways Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are embracing the maker movement in makerspaces, which is really exciting. And the second reason we decided to host these YouTube live sessions was to drop in and just to visit with you and see how you're making out and where you are in your makerspace journey. Are you just starting out? Do you already have a space that's up and running and you're looking for support and help and ideas? Or you're just looking to connect with other people that are also creating maker spaces in their schools? So, or maybe perhaps you're a parent or a community leader or even a student who is interested in getting into maker spaces. So, whatever your reason for joining us today, we're very happy to have you. We are Brilliant Labs. We are a nonprofit organization designed to promote creativity and entrepreneurship in the classroom. So we love makerspaces. I'm just going to get this tutorial started. I'm going to do a little slideshow. But first, before we do that, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping. You'll know that this is my first YouTube live session, so bear with me as I make my way through some technical difficulties. We're going to show a little slideshow now, and we're going to work through that slideshow. And again, a little bit of housekeeping. So if you have any questions or any ideas or thoughts as we go through this broadcast, feel free to send them in via the chat. My partner, Jacob, is out there monitoring the chat line, so we'll do our best to answer questions in a timely fashion. Because this is our first one, if I happen to miss a question, don't worry, I will definitely add it in the notes section of the YouTube Live tutorial video. So let's get started. Today we're going to talk about makerspaces, and more specifically, we're going to talk about makerspaces in your school. When we think about the typical makerspace, we think about the industrial space in the community where people are using some pretty serious tools and skills. They're building and prototyping and doing all kinds of inventive and crazy things. Makerspaces allow community members to design and prototype and manufacture. So it sounds a bit overwhelming when we think about putting one of those in a school. And I think maybe that's probably the reason we get some hesitation, or some people just maybe wanting a little bit more information before they jump into the maker movement. So this image of the makerspace implies a significant amount of investment in both time and resources, not to mention skills in manufacturing and design. But really, a makerspace at its very basic level is simply a space where people come together to invent, explore, and learn. That's it. Nothing more complicated than that. It's a space where we come together to learn and explore. A quote in the Makerspace Playbook, which happens to be the playbook that a lot of people inventing and starting their own makerspaces go by. The quote happens to say that makerspaces come in all shapes and sizes, but they serve as a gathering point for tools, projects, mentors, and expertise. A collection of tools does not define a makerspace. Rather, we define it by what it enables, making. So if you think about that, that's all we really need to know for a makerspace. We don't need to get overwhelmed with the facts or with the equipment or with all the skills we need to know. We just need to basically keep in mind that it's about making. And let's look at that word itself. Let's break that makerspace word down a little bit. You have makers plus spaces. So if you think about who are makers and what are makers, maybe if you want to jump in and send me a couple of thoughts on your own, I encourage you to do that now. But really, a maker is just someone who makes, someone who creates rather than consumes. There are all kinds of makers among us. We have craftspeople, artists, designers, engineers, hackers, computer programmers, seamstresses, chefs. The world is full of makers, and this maker space is really a place to celebrate and to start and to experience making. And if we think about the space, we could just kind of look at it quickly and say, oh yeah, space, that just means a room of some kind to put all these tools and kind of do the physical work of making. But the space actually signifies much more than that. In this space, we actually think about more of like a place where you come together, where you take time to reflect and explore. So the space is more than just a physical location. It's the idea that in this maker space, you take time to reflect, explore, tinker, and kind of figure out. So the maker and the space are both significant in this word. And as we go through our discussion, it really helps if we frame it that way. So if we think of it as a creative space where people come together to work and to build. So I hope this kind of gives you a little bit of perspective and takes away that fear of the giant industrial sized, very equipment heavy, technical based makerspace that we tend to see out in the world today. So a makerspace can be something as simple as a cart with Legos. It can include 3D printing, Play-Doh, claymation, video, include pretty much anything you want it to do. So if we take time now to think about our understanding of makerspaces and refine it to ask, well, what then would be a school-based makerspace? And are they different or the same? Are they the same as a traditional makerspace that you'd go to in your community? And if they are different, what makes them different? The obvious answer is probably curriculum and time. We all feel the crunch of getting the curriculum covered in the length of the school year, and we also feel the time. There's only so many hours in the day. So I think curriculum and time will be something that we'll have to discuss as we go through this YouTube session, but we can get to that a little bit later. So there's one thing that we need to keep in mind as we go through, and that is that every child has the right to invent, tinker, create, innovate, make, and do. So as we go through, we're going to think about that. We're going to think about uh, students inventing, tinkering, creating, and more. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to check my YouTube live stream. There we go. Perfect. And now Brilliant Labs has actually been building makerspaces in the Atlantic provinces in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick for 2 years already. So time is flying. So we're going to look a little bit at our experiences too as we go through this session. At this point, I'd like to share just a little video that we made to highlight some of the things that are happening in Nova Scotia. Later on, we'll show a little video of what's happening in New Brunswick. So for now, I just want to click on this video and show you a little bit about what's happening in Nova Scotia in our makerspaces. So one thing that happened, our team recently went to Maker Faire in New York, and we got to see this wonderful presentation. But at the beginning of the presentation, they really took some time, and they thought, we're all pumped, we're all excited, we all support maker spaces. But rather than, oops, sorry about that. Welcome to Brilliant Labs video. There you go. Sorry. But we went to the Brilliant Lab. We went to the Maker Faire New York. So we got to go to this wonderful presentation, and we were able to, as part of this presentation, they did this little speed drill or warm up the audience type of event. And they thought, everyone in this room supports maker spaces. We all believe in making. We are makers ourselves. So we often tend to spread the positive. We tend to talk about maker spaces, and our eyes light up and our hands start to move, and we get really, really excited and passionate about what we do. So the first activity was, let's as a group, come up with some great positive words about maker spaces. So the hands were up and everybody was throwing out words, and I've included just a few here. here. If you're watching live, feel free to add into the chat section some words that you think of that are positive when we're talking about makerspaces. We think about making, building, learning, creating, innovation, hands-on, prototyping, projects, exploring. So all really, really positive things. But as in anything, and with anyone that does promotion or that does try to spread and create a movement, we tend to focus on the positive. What about the negative? So it was really reflective as they then jumped into a conversation about the negative words in makerspaces. And of course, there are negative words, and there are challenges, and there are things we have to overcome. So when they started to shout out some negative words, we focused on things like it's expensive because, of course, you need tools, you need space, you need consumables. There's a failure. And of course, that's what making is all about. It's about making and creating, but you don't make this beautiful masterpiece your first time out. You don't create, you're not successful every project you attempt. Not every idea is $1 million idea. So there's an incredible amount of failure and there's great joy in learning from the failure, but that's a skill in itself. It's tough to fail. It's often overwhelming. So uh, if you think about walking into that space as the teacher, it's very overwhelming to think you have to know everything about the space. There's a huge sense of responsibility. Who's responsible for the space? And one word that came out was competitive. That's not one I would have thought of, but yeah, for sure. So if you're in a room full of people, is your idea as good as the next person's idea? Is there a sense of competition? How do we deal with that? Time, of course, time is always the enemy. There's never enough time to do what we want to do. Scheduling links into time. There's a huge learning curve, and of course, the consumables piece. So I think it's important as we frame this discussion not to say that makerspaces are the be all end all or that you're going to create a makerspace and be successful your first time out. There are learning experiences, and just like anything in life, there are positives and negatives. Actually, we consider that our role at Brilliant Labs. We're happy to participate and to help you with your overcome your negatives. But I think from the get-go, it's important to realize that yeah, there is there's a learning curve. There's lots happening. There are great, wonderful things, and there are positive. There are some negative things that we also have to deal with. So a reminder that if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to our chat line. So now that we've set the stage for what a makerspace is, it's time to talk about what it looks like. So we have that picture of that industrial space in our mind, but that's not what our school makerspaces look like. I've put up on the screen there, you can see those are some typical scenes from a makerspaces in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. You'll notice that it's divided into sections. We tend to organize our workspace into common areas. But the real good thing about makerspaces is they break down silos. If you think traditionally about all the arts or all the skills, you may do sewing in one room, you may do woodworking in another, you may do cooking in another, and art and video in another room. The idea of the makerspace is to combine all those disciplines. So you have a little taste of each of those disciplines in one space. They're divided into sections within the room, mostly for organizational purposes, but you usually see makerspaces, all the equipment and the supplies are along the outside, and on the inside you see all these great working spaces, whether they be benches and stools, tables and chairs, a lot of floor space, a lot of activity happens on the floor in makerspaces. And the idea with makerspaces is we're reimagining how tools and materials are used. So we're not trying to stick to the same traditional silos. We're trying to make the room a series of stations. We have textiles, robotics, video production. Then there would be the common work areas, and then the projects would incorporate all of those work areas depending on what you wanted to do. You may have a project that incorporates textiles and electronics. There are all kinds. You may do video and drone footage. You may do drone footage with your physical activity. So we're seeing all kinds of cross-curricular projects, and that's the idea of the makerspace. That's why we want to see all those tools and all those accessories in one room with people with access to all. And while this appears to be, so sometimes if we first walk into a makerspace, there appears to be a lot of chaos, and to the untrained eye, it may appear more than chaos. But that's the point. It's different from a traditional classroom. It's all about bringing all the disciplines together and working together to get that inspiration. And while this appears to be a vague answer when someone asks what's in a makerspace, and we say everything, or we say all of the different disciplines, we say all kinds of different answers depending on the time and the space and the school. And I know it appears vague, and for some people it's a little difficult because they want us to give you that, you want to get that shopping list. It's like going for it's like making a recipe. So you want us to give you a recipe and say, pick up these 10 ingredients, and I will have the most fabulous makerspace. But unfortunately, makerspaces don't work that way. And it's not really unfortunate, actually. It's a great thing that they don't work that way because every space can then be designed to your particular needs to match your culture and the school that you have. So, the key to the makerspace, and I think you probably realize this, and I'm trying to get to this, but the key to a makerspace is not in the tools, but in the way the space and the tools are used. So, what happens in a makerspace, we're reminded of a very key fact about making, and that is making is grounded in play. Dale Doherty, who's the head of CEO of Make Magazine and has written a number of books on the subject, says he's always trying to remind people that making is grounded in play. And then I found another quote that takes it a little bit further. You'll see Amanda Bindle says, making as play embodies real world learning. Kids learn a skill and practice it. They fail frequently, which forces them to evaluate and try again. Failure and risk go hand in hand with authentic learning. So that's kind of what we try to get at in the makerspace. It's not about success right away. It's not about following a plan or a recipe. It's about experimentation, exploring, crossing disciplines, and really trying to solve complex problems with what are maybe simple or traditional materials. So that's a lot of information to take in, and it may be what you've already thought about as a makerspace, and it may be something new for you. And you may feel that we haven't really given you any information at all. So it's kind of nice maybe if we just stay tuned and we keep talking about makerspace, and hopefully as we get a little further into this discussion, it may start to become clear what your makerspace could and should look like. But right now, we should talk about what most teachers want to talk about and what most parents also probably want to talk about. Where does the curriculum fit in? It's fine to say it's about play, but what does that mean? And how can we measure it? And how can we then incorporate the curriculum to fit in? Well, you may have guessed from the video that I played of what's happening in the spaces in Nova Scotia. Just by watching that video, I'm sure you saw many ways that those makerspace projects could fit into the curriculum of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And that, in fact, happens. It almost happens naturally. What happens in a makerspace naturally fits the curriculum. So each and every activity is based on problem solving, exploration, research, and skill building. And even those that aren't based so much in those things, they definitely have a presentation and a report component. So, and as you can imagine, makerspaces are great spots for STEAM learning. And we'll do another session in the future where we're going to cover how to actually use specific tools and materials to reach curricular outcomes. Today's discussion is more of an overview of makerspaces and what you can do and what you can expect in a makerspace. But we will definitely, especially as we get into these sessions and these YouTube live sessions, we're definitely going to focus and we're going to guide you through and help you kind of match your curriculum to what's happening in your makerspace. So the activities in the makerspace are mostly project based. The students are encouraged to take ownership of their education and use tools and materials that connect to them and that make sense to them. And that's kind of, we want to give these kids control over their own education. So if you thought about what does that mean? How could that be in my classroom? So let me think. Let me come up with an idea. So let's say, and we tend to always lean toward the technology. So let's pick a social studies element. Let's say the War of 1812. We'll use that as an example. So the curricular topic is the War of 1812. How can we use the War of 1812? What could we possibly do in a makerspace that relates to that? So let's think about what we have in the makerspace. What if we perhaps one student chooses to use the 3D printer and print a replica object of something that was used in the battle? What if another student focuses on recreating costumes that were used at that period of time, so studies fashion design from that time period? Perhaps another would do a video animation of an epic battle, so make characters that then act out the battle that they saw. Maybe another will use green screen to set the scene of the battle or the scene of the war, or the scene of the time period. Maybe they'll use the topography, the climate, the conditions, and actually create a video that makes us feel as if we're there. Maybe someone else would make an audio recording of a long forgotten wartime ballad. Think about if all of the students were all working on the same topic, but yet each one is taking a different tool and a different angle and exploring what interests them about that particular subject area. And then if each of those students was to present their topic, think how enriched and how much deeper the learning would be. That's just my idea on the War of 1812. But again, and that's just off the top of my head, that's just thinking about what could happen in a makerspace. So I do want to make one special mention before we leave what happens in a makerspace. I want to make a special mention with regards to coding. So learning to code has become the new buzzword. We hear it all the time. It's in the news, it's in the media, it's in the curriculum. But what does it really mean to learn to code? Does it mean that everyone must become a software engineer? No. The reason we want to think about code is computer code, or the language that computer speaks. Computer code is actually running many of the applications that we take for granted and we use in our everyday lives, whether that be computer programming and software and the internet, whether it be robots, our vehicles, our planes, our water treatment plants. Computer code is everywhere. So our goal is not to teach and force students to memorize another language, but so that students can understand how code impacts their life and what that means, and maybe they have an opportunity to not only learn the skill but to use it in the future. We want to make sure that students are more than just consumers. It's not about buying the latest and greatest video game or iPad or application. It's about learning to create with the software. It's about learning to control things in the outside world. Actually, before we started this video session, I was going to look up how many things are expected to be connected to the internet in the next couple of years. I did have last year's figure, but I'm sure it's even astronomically larger now. But when we talk about the internet, most of the content on the internet, in fact, almost all of the content on the internet, has been created by people. So whether that be websites, videos, photos, all human generated content. But in the upcoming years, we're going to see all kinds of content that's been created by sensors and data, all kinds of things uploading to the internet, what we would consider the Internet of Things. We'll do a separate section on the Internet of Things, but just something to keep in mind that in these makerspaces, we have a real opportunity to introduce students to code, not just to build a game, but to actually make things work. So we do a lot of focus on robotics. So we do a lot of electronics and circuits and sensors, all kinds of very exciting real world activities. Anyway, I just wanted to give the little plug for Learn to Code. So aside from the great successes and the many challenges, there are many challenges in starting a makerspace. So we have the excitement, we have the kids, we have everything happening. So let's talk about some of the things we've experienced over the last 2 years as we've been setting up these makerspaces across the country, across the Atlantic provinces. Initially, of course, there's the excitement of creating the space. There's nothing more exciting than walking in a makerspace with all that new equipment, everything in boxes, and getting to unpack and set it all up. So it's quite exciting. But once it's built and the chairs are in place and the lights are on and the room is painted and we're ready to go, we really then kind of start to ask those tough questions. How can I bring a class down to this space? How can I access it? Whose turn is it? Who's responsible for cleaning it? Who is allowed to use all the consumables? Is my class allowed to use all the Play-Doh? What about all the electronics? So there are all kinds of discussions that then have to take place at a school level. So we at Brilliant Labs are welcome. We're here all the time. We're very welcoming. We'd love to help you with those conversations, and they really are unique to your school and your place. But one thing we want to talk about is access and the belief that every child is a maker. Everyone is a maker. So we really want to see everyone use the makerspace. There should be no limits. Of course, there may be limits based on the tools and age appropriateness and the content and age appropriateness, but basically all ages are makers. Everyone is a maker. The earlier they start, the more making they will do in their lifetime. So we want to make sure that students are exposed to making. In our experience, across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, there are a lot of schools that are taking a different approach to access, and many of them seem to be working, and it's all based on what works in your school, in your community, in your culture. So some have tried Teachers have been assigned certain times throughout the schedule to take their class into the makerspace, so that works well in some schools. In some schools, they've actually started lunch and after school programming, so students that maybe don't get enough time during the day would then like to add more time and start after school clubs, so that's working quite well. In still other spaces, some teachers are going down when it's curriculum specific. So perhaps the science teacher has a project that would really lend itself well to some of the tools and materials in the makerspace, and that teacher is signing up for time in the makerspace at that particular time. So there really are no rules. It's basically about giving everyone access and kind of managing the space depending on how it works for yours. Um, One thing I will mention one school is doing to encourage more teachers and students to use the space is they have a group of support helpers or makerspace supporters. So an example of this, in one school they're doing what they're calling coding buddies. So it's working much the same and very similar to the Successful Reading Buddies program. So they're actually having the older kids that once they've learned to do a little bit of code, they're actually partnering up with some students in grades 2, 3, or 4, and they're working together on a coding project. This is working very, very well, and you're seeing that peer-to-peer learning. So that's a great example. In another case, one other school recruited 12 or 13 of the grade 6s, showed them how to do the robotics using Lego EV3. So they learned how to use the robotics kit very, very well. And then they offered tutorials for the younger grades as well. So you're seeing all kinds of that interclass and mixing of ages and peer mentoring. So that's really working out quite well. But this leads to our next question. And the next question is, who are the experts? So who are the experts in the room? And if you're lucky at your school, you may already have a champion teacher. That one person who spends hours designing and planning and making. That one person who promotes making in the classroom and has been pushing for a makerspace in your school at every opportunity. We've met so many champions across our province. It's very impressive. They're inspiring. But while we celebrate them and we're very happy and our schools are very lucky to have them, we must admit that it's not sustainable. This model is not sustainable. You cannot have a successful makerspace in the long term with the responsibility falling to just one or two teachers. We need to build capacity in your school or your organization. And to do this, there needs to be a cultural shift. Making needs to become part of the culture. So we need to start thinking about how we become makers, how we use our makerspace more, how we use it across disciplines. Can we use it in gym class? Can we use it in science, math? How can we be building and making and supporting those champion teachers so that making becomes a sustainable activity at your school? And that leads us to the question, who are the experts? Traditionally, the teacher is the leader of the class. The teacher is the expert in all areas of the subject. If you have a question about math, you go to the math teacher. If you have a question about physical activity, you go to the gym teacher. And these teachers are experts in their field, and experts indeed. But the makerspace is a multidisciplinary space. So there are new and emerging technologies. There are bits and pieces from almost every subject area. There is simply too much in a makerspace for one person to be an expert. So we need to use other ways of interacting in the makerspace. We can't think about the expert in the makerspace. In this space, there are no experts. Everyone is learning together, everyone is sharing what they've learned, and everyone is asking questions. The teacher is the guide. The teachers are not expected to be the experts in the makerspace. And thank goodness, it's tough to keep up with everything new in the makerspace. In this space, the teacher is vital, though. Vital to promote a sense of wonder and play, to encourage exploration, to acknowledge failure when it happens and support rebuilding. The teacher plays a very important role, but it's more of a support person or guide than expert. So we need to not put pressures on our teachers to learn to adapt all of the latest technologies, because as soon as you learn one technology, it's going to change. So we need to think of the teacher as a guide in the makerspace. And what we're experiencing in many of the spaces, and in fact I would venture to say almost all of the spaces, is that the students are becoming the teachers. It's quite inspiring to see. They're embracing the idea of Googling the answer or asking their neighbor when they have help. They're openly sharing what they've learned. You see all the coding buddies and the robotics buddies. It's pretty impressive. And it's really fun. There's nothing more inspiring than being in a makerspace and hearing, I did it, and I'm a genius, and come look what I made. So you hear that all day long in the makerspace. So, in addition to learning together, there's a role for other community members. So, it's not just about teachers and students, it's about community members. So, as you're thinking about your makerspace or as you're planning to grow your makerspace, maybe you want to think about who in your community is a maker. Do you have computer community members that sew or solder or build robots or plant and garden? Look around your community and identify the makers and invite them in to assist. There are so many makers that live among us, and they're happy to share their skills. We have small business owners and engineers and software developers. They're only too happy to come in and do a session with your school. One more thing, I know we're kind of running out of time. I promised I'd only keep you for half an hour, and we're just about there. But I also want to talk about funding because makerspaces, of course, aren't free. We don't just get all this equipment and all of these consumables and they're just replenished every day. So we need to talk about funding. Right now, we're seeing some funding coming from governments and the Department of Ed. We're seeing some great local businesses and corporations step up to provide funding, and we're also seeing some great private contributors sending money to makerspaces. So there's lots of great things happening, and Brilliant Labs and the Department of Ed and lots of other people are working to kind of create and promote those resources. But don't forget and don't be shy about asking others for help. Perhaps there's a fabric supplier in your community and that person would give you the leftover fabric swatches for your space. Perhaps there's someone who does electronics or plumbing or something like that. And there are all kinds of materials lying around. Makerspaces don't have to be all high tech and they don't have to be about brand new items. A lot of times we learn from recycled materials and or items that can be used again. So start thinking about that as you think about your makerspace. Maybe there are seamstresses with extra sewing machines or computers in schools that are no longer being used and can be taken apart. There are all kinds of places to get some real cool projects for your makerspace. So we just encourage you to do that. And another thing too, don't be shy about thinking about entrepreneurship. Lately, aside from learn to code, entrepreneurship is probably the next buzzword. But makerspaces are a great place for entrepreneurships to happen. Actually, I have a little example here. One student in one makerspace in Nova Scotia is actually printing 3D printing fidget toys and selling them in their makerspace. So actually selling them to make a profit, and all the profit goes to buy more consumables for the makerspace. So start to think about that in your space. What can you create and make and perhaps sell? Learn those entrepreneurship skills and also fund your makerspace. So the final point I want to make about makerspaces is share what you've learned. Share your successes, share your failures. As we travel in Brilliant Labs, as we travel throughout the provinces and we get the joy of entering schools and hearing and learning about everything that's happening, we're just amazed. There are so many projects happening in our schools that many people never hear anything about. We have to encourage teachers to brag about what you're doing. Celebrate your successes. Come out of your comfort zone and say, look, this is what I'm doing in my classroom, and it's fabulous. And you'll inspire someone else to maybe repeat the same project. And in that vein, we at Brilliant Labs are trying to we're trying to help promote the wonderful things that are happening in our schools. So we have a portal at brilliantlabs.ca. We encourage you to write a blog, to send a post, send us some pictures, share your stories about how you've been sharing, introducing making into your classroom. We'd love to hear them, and so would other teachers and mentors across the provinces. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are really embracing the makerspace and the makerspace are really embracing the makerspace movement. So we encourage you to get involved and tell us what you're doing. Share your stories. Let's inspire more people. For those of you who haven't started a makerspace or maybe on the fence, I encourage you to give it a try. Start small. Contact us at Brilliant Labs and we'll maybe help you with a brilliant project. So projects are another source of funding. We have a project fund for projects that maybe are just one-time project that you need help to buy equipment and supplies in order to complete your project. So don't be shy. Reach out. We're more than willing to help. Check out our website or contact us. And we want to remember that we want to embrace this maker movement because it's about more than playing. It's about more than making. It's about the future. It's about creating lifelong learners that will venture out in the world. It's about inspiring the next generation of engineers and artists that will work on problems ranging from food insecurity to global warming. It's about inspiring the next generation that will work on projects from self-driving vehicles to recreational space travel. And it's about building the skills, confidence, and mindset to create, to make creators rather than consumers. So that's our goal. That's what we're all about. We're about creating, exploring, and changing the future. With that said, a few final tips on where you start. So I'd encourage you to get together with your students and your fellow teachers. Talk about what you want to accomplish, what you think your space should look like, how it can reflect your school culture. Reach out to us at Brilliant Labs and the department, your principals, your department contacts, your tech support leaders. Recruit community members that may support your project. And check out our website for information. I'll also attach a great list of starter resources at the end of this tutorial. But the most important thing is just get started. Contact us and let us know how we can be of help. And that's about it. So if there are no questions, there don't appear to be any questions on the chat line. I've kind of been talking for more than a half an hour now, so I'm going to kind of wind this down. But I hope I've been able to provide you some insight into school makerspaces. This was my first YouTube live tutorial, so forgive any flaws and inconsistencies. And I want to leave you with one final thought. We showed you what's happening in Nova Scotia, so now we want to kind of show you what's happening in New Brunswick, just to show you both provinces are doing fabulous things in their makerspaces. We will continue to let us know what you think about this YouTube live session. In upcoming sessions, we're hoping to start gathering people together. We're going to start to show you how to use specific tools to meet specific curriculum outcomes and how we can kind of start to promote even more making in our classrooms. Thank you for joining us.